One of the major challenges of post-colonial Africa has been the state and how the state, rather than creating that enabling environment for private businesses to prosper and to grow, has actually constrained business through corrupt regimes, through regimes that have actually, killed and imprisoned the people, have robbed them of their human rights and dignity. So that's the environment really which we could describe the Amin era and some of the regimes that went on after Idi Amin right up to 1986 when we had the current president, Yoweri Museveni, come into power. And essentially what you had was, entrepreneurs, people who would even be seen as remotely successful, would either be imprisoned or would be killed, or a whole class of professionals, academics, entrepreneurs, lost their lives just because they were seen as a threat to the state. And my own father was imprisoned for over a year and a half for nothing else but because he was an entrepreneur who was seen to be successful and seen to be independent. And that's really the environment I grew up in. And the lessons I learned was how states can constrain enterprise, can constrain entrepreneurs, rather than enable them, as they really should, by building infrastructure and creating the environment for them. There's a difference between foreign aid and humanitarian assistance. And the arguments that I make against aid tend to be, the foreign aid that goes into government treasuries. And there are three principal problems with that. One, governments cannot be the engine for economic growth. They can create that enabling environment, but the engines for economic growth are the private sector. And in a situation where the private sector doesn't have access to sufficient capital, but you have a lot of capital going to government treasuries, I think there's a real fundamental problem with that architecture, that design, the design that we will give money to African governments and then that will spur growth. I don't think that's the way to spur growth. The way to spur growth is to give capital to the private sector. And in a situation where the private sector is experiencing real market failures, which is the failure for the markets to allocate cheap and affordable capital to enterprises, especially in agriculture. In Uganda, for example, only 4% of the total loans go into the agriculture sector. It's really difficult. I experienced that myself, trying to visit banks and private equity firms to raise capital for my business. Real challenge. The second issue is that aid creates real chronic dependency. Governments begin to look to donors for this money, and they depend on donors, and they also end up being accountable to the donor community. And the third issue is really one where we find the stifling of creativity amongst the community that is a recipient of aid. Instead of thinking about creative ways, innovative ways to do business, to produce products and services, to generate income and pay taxes and create this independence for their countries, that creativity is stifled because they know they can receive the handout. They know they'll receive an aid disbursement. So aid really has that challenge. And in a way, it might be well-meaning, but it's misguided, because no country in the world has ever prospered through handouts. None. There is no country. All countries that have developed their economies and created prosperity in their societies have done it through hard work, innovation, by the entrepreneurs producing products and services, paying taxes, and governments responding to the needs of the private sector, and not just the needs and the conditionalities of the donors who give them the aid. The British government, with its overseas assistance, could target private enterprises, could create capital, funds and challenger funds, but in a real significant way, not just these small funds that are created for environmentally specific projects and things like that, but to really say, okay, we're going to put a percentage of the capital that we're putting into African governments, and we're going to put a percentage of that to be available for the private sector. I don't think China and Africa is really a problem as many people out in the West claim it might be. So when I look at China, I don't see China as this big bad dragon coming into the continent to pillage. I say, okay, if they've got capital, if they're coming to invest as they claim, are we ready? Are we putting our young people into colleges where they can learn Mandarin? Are we sending our young people to China to learn the culture, to learn how to engage effectively with this old and ancient Oriental civilization? Are we equipped to negotiate better deals than we are, when they come in to invest in infrastructure? Are we negotiating the best deals that we can? The challenge is not China coming to Africa. The challenge is Africa ready to negotiate with them as they welcome them to Africa. And this should go with every other potential investors on the continent, large, sovereign, or private.